So this discussion is going to look at some general resistance training recommendations. So these are just some general things as it relates to strength training. Again, obviously in the other strength conditioning classes, we go into these things way more in depth, but I just kind of want you to understand some exercise classifications and just kind of the way we kind of organize the resistance training exercises based on body part. You can still, this isn't classically out of a chapter from your textbook, but there's still some information in your textbook that you could look at. I'd encourage you to review all of the resistance training exercises that are in that chapter, reading with the exercise techniques. There's the whole page range of exercise illustrations along with the exercises and the muscles that they work. So please make sure to review those as a part of that reading. So in looking at resistance training, we look at what the goals of resistance training are. So again, you'll design your protocol based upon what it is you're trying to achieve. So our primary goals for resistance training are improve strength, improve power, because remember, strength and power aren't the same thing. Okay, so strength is just the ability to apply force. Power is force and velocity. Okay, so it's two different things. So strength, power, hypertrophy, or an increase in the size of the muscles, or muscular endurance, which is just repeated submaximal efforts. So we look at exercises, we kind of classify exercises in different ways. So you have your primary movements. So primary movements are usually, you also hear people use the term core lifts. Now by core there, they're not referring to the abdomen and low back like you typically hear about people with core training, but these are the movements that are multi-joint movements that kind of represent, I call them kind of indicator lifts to really see if athletes are getting stronger. So we have three classifications for that. We have your total body lifts, which are essentially your Olympic lifts. So your clean, your snatch, and your push jerk and push press. They're your total body movements. Your lower body movements, for instance, would be exercises like the squat and the deadlift variations, and then your upper body movements, again, your primary pressing movements. You can also use primary pulling movements as that as well. But these are, again, are bigger multi-joint exercises. These are like exercises, again, you would test to test, various levels of strength. Then you have your auxiliary movements. Your auxiliary movements are used to basically help improve the primary movements. So these are typically single joint, although they could be multi-joint movements as well. For instance, in the lower body, a lot of times people use things like lunges and split squats as auxiliary movements. And they're not single joint movements. They are technically multi-joint movements. Even things like dumbbell presses, push-ups, stuff like that. They're usually used as auxiliary movements, but they're multi-joint, meaning they use multiple joints. But classically, a lot of times you do hear people talk about like single joint movements, leg curls, movements for the arms, the shoulders that only work at one joint. Again, these are typically used when you really want to work on a weak point. So for instance, if we know that, like, take for instance the hamstrings and or the glutes are a weakness for a lot of individuals, you'll use auxiliary movements to kind of focus on those, because again, you can't really work out individual weaknesses with the primary movements because they're multi-joint in nature, that if you'll tend to cover up your weaknesses more with other muscle groups. So the auxiliary movements can kind of assist with that. Now this is actually something that does come out of your textbook. So here you see the whole hypertrophy, strength, power continuum. So if you look at this and it talks about the training goals, it shows you what the rep ranges are and where the primary adaptations come in. So really, when you're working on any of these things, you will still get slight changes in the other variables. So take for instance here where your main training goal is hypertrophy. So you're seeing the rep range for hypertrophy, but you do see you are getting a degree of muscular endurance, strength, and power even when you're working on hypertrophy. However, the primary adaptation you're working for is hypertrophy. So you kind of see with hypertrophy, you see that becoming a bigger, emphasis in the 6 to 12 rep range approximately. And again, you'll still have increases in power and strength. It's just not going to be as much. That's where your primary focus is going to be. Again, when you look at strength and power, so everything's going to be, you know, in strength, you're looking at, you know, 6 reps and below. Power, you're looking at 5 reps and below for that. Again, there'll still be changes in hypertrophy and, you know, very little in muscular endurance, but there's still carryover. So we have what the primary adaptation is, and then we have, you know, the secondary things that come about. But again, these are based upon where you're looking at with this, on this repetition maximum continuum, those are where your adaptations are going to take place. So the methods of strength training, and these are taken out of the Science and Practice of Strength Training. So these are not in your textbook, but these are ways in which we can look at measure methods of strength. You have the maximal effort method, you have the submaximal repeated effort method, and you have the dynamic effort method. So I'm going to be talking about when we're looking at these different methods of strength training, we're going to break these down further in a bit. But these are the 3 primary methods. Now you see submaximal repeated effort method. There is a slight there is a break off with how you'd describe one versus the other. They both kind of fall under the same category essentially, though. But we'll talk about, you know, later on the parameters for these and what it looks like we're looking to achieve with each one. So when we're looking at loading, there's different things we obviously have to look at. Obviously, sets and reps are ways we always look to kind of program our variables. So sets are basically a group of reps. So when you say, for instance, someone's doing 3 sets of 10, that means they're doing 10 repetitions of the exercise. They're resting a prescribed rest period, and then they're performing another set of 10, okay? So a set is essentially a group of reps. Now, usually you're going to kind of base your workout on intensity measures, and there's 4 ways to measure intensity. One is the magnitude of the resistance, okay? So with the magnitude of the resistance is basically saying how heavy you're basically doing it. Another way is through the number of repetitions, okay? That's the second way we measure intensity. The third way is the number or percentage of repetitions with maximal weight. And then the fourth is the workout density, or the number of sets in a workout. So those are the 4 ways we kind of look at intensity. Now, classically, a lot of times the way people will kind of, again, measure intensity typically is through percentages of 1 repetition max when they're trying to tell you how hard to basically work at an exercise. So for instance, many times they'll say do 3 sets of 10 with 65% of what your 1 repetition max. So basically you'd be taking 65% of what your 1 repetition max of the exercise would be, and you do your 3 sets of 10 with that. Okay, that's one way of kind of doing that. A series, so a lot of times people talk about sets and reps. They don't talk about a series. So a set is a group of reps. A series is a group of sets. Now you don't hear people using the series method a whole lot. There are certain advanced procedures where you will use that. Again, I kind of give some insight into that, into some of the other strength classes, but you don't hear that a whole lot. But that is another way. For now, you just have to know that a series is a group of sets. I'm not going to ask you to actually show me how to do that. And you don't see it a whole lot, but there are instances where you'll actually group your sets, and after so many sets, take a longer rest interval, and then do another series of sets. There's certain techniques where that becomes relevant. The volume load looks at essentially how much weight you're actually doing within a workout. So all you would essentially do with that is for all your exercises that you do, you'd multiply the weight by the number of total repetitions that you did for the workout. You'd add it all together. That would give you what's called your volume load. Your repetition volume just looks at the total number of repetitions. So all you'd simply do here is take your sets by your reps, add it all up, and that would give you what would be called your repetition volume. So the difference between load volume actually, or volume load, that actually just looks at how much weight you're doing, okay? Whereas repetition volume looks at how many total reps you've done. And then your rest periods. So rest periods get to be important because, again, when you're working on different adaptations, you have to have appropriate rest between attempts. So for strength and power, they recommend typically between 2 and 5 minutes between sets. For hypertrophy, anywhere from 30 seconds to a minute and 30 seconds, and endurance less than or equal to 30 seconds. So again, so for really heavy attempts, when you're working on strength and power, they want to make sure you're taking long rest intervals to make sure that you're fresh for each one. Now, for hypertrophy and muscular endurance, the rest periods get shorter, but again, that's purposeful because they want you to be working kind of on that the metabolic aspect of the muscle. So looking at those methods of strength development, we're going to look first at the max effort method. So the idea with the max effort method, this is obviously using very high intensities, very heavy weights. It's to help improve neuromuscular coordination. So again, lifting weights isn't just all about just increasing the size of muscles. We're also looking for nervous system adaptations to take place. So maximal effort method works intra and intermuscular coordination. So what this means is intramuscular coordination, that's within a muscle. So it teaches you to recruit motor units. So remember what motor units are based upon what we talked about earlier in the year. It's the motor nerve and all the muscle fibers that it innervates. So it helps to recruit more motor units within a muscle, and it works intermuscular coordination, which means you're recruiting all of the muscles around a lift. So in other words, when you do a very heavy back squat, for instance, you're recruiting all those muscles around your hips and knees. You're recruiting the muscles that work statically at the low back and abdomen. You're doing that, okay? The repetitions for this, it depends on the goal. Typically, with the max effort method, with bigger lifts, you're going to do somewhere between 1 and 5 repetitions. So you will work you will work sometimes up to a 1 repetition max. And again, that's going to help improve that neuromuscular coordination. Usually if movement is really the goal, so you're really focused on, for instance, the lift, whether it be one of the Olympic lifts or one of the power lifts, you'll be in the 1 to 3 rep range. So you'll work up to a 1 to 3 rep max if the movement is the goal. Sometimes if you want to kind of work the muscle a little bit, you'll focus a little bit more on the higher repetitions, getting upwards to 5. The submaximal and repeated effort methods are both methods used for hypertrophy. The only difference between the two of these is the submaximal effort uses intermediate reps, whereas the repeated effort method is where you take it to failure or at least near failure with it. So you'll typically work basically whatever repetitions you're using, you will take it to that point of exhaustion. With both of these, you're typically looking at usually greater than 6 repetitions. Sometimes with the submaximal effort, you may go a little bit lower with the repetitions, but again, they'll still be submaximal efforts. They won't be utilizing weights that cause you to go to exhaustion. And then the dynamic effort method, this is where you're actually looking to increase rate of force development and explosive strength, okay? Or what you're trying to do is improve the explosive strength deficit. Remember, with sports, beyond just being strong, it's also the ability to display that strength or the ability to produce force in a fast manner, okay? So this is where you're going to take weights and you're going to move there. You're going to focus on that fast rate of force development. We're going to move them fast. Usually the percentage range for this is anywhere, you'll typically see 30 upwards to 70%, depending upon the type of lifts. And when I'm referring to those percentages, that's of a 1 repetition max. So anywhere from 30 to 70% is usually where you'll be, and you'll be somewhere in the range of 1 to 5 reps. The reason why you want such low reps, even at lower percentages, is again, the objective here is to move the weight fast. So you'll sometimes do, for instance, instead of doing like 3 sets of 12, you might do 12 sets of 3 at 40% of your 1 rep max or 50% of your 1 rep max. But the idea is for each set, you're performing those 3 reps with as much speed as possible. So here's just some examples of some different type of split routines, and these are in your textbook. So you could see, you know, classically, this is kind of the way, and again, everyone kind of finds ways to program. I'm a lower and upper body programming person, so usually 4 times a week, so lower body, upper body, lower body, upper body. You see some other splits here. This one kind of using, you know, pressing muscles, the lower body, and your pulling muscles. So again, your chest, shoulders, and triceps are your pressing muscles. So when you look at all your primary pressing movements, they're the prime movers for that. Whereas your, you know, the muscles in your back, your lats, your trapezius muscles, your rhomboids, your biceps, they're your pulling muscles. Okay. And, you know, so that's one way to break that down. And there's also kind of, you know, so some of these are kind of closer to like bodybuilding splits. Some people also will use total body splits where they'll work the entire body, maybe 3 days a week. Once you get into the point where you want some strength retention, you may back off to maybe only 2 workouts a week. So 2 days a week, if planned appropriately, can work really well for strength retention. Some people actually gain strength sometimes when they're so used to training so many times a week. If they cut back to doing just maybe 2 sessions a week, they sometimes actually sometimes get stronger from that because they actually have more time to recover. So sometimes people find that even when they're going to those strength retention or strength maintenance routines of twice a week, they could sometimes find that they may actually get a little bit stronger. Now that'll only last for so long because particularly for more experienced people, they're going to need more volume. But sometimes people could find that they actually make some better progress if they back off for a while because it just allows for increased recovery. So again, recovery is the important point, and we want to look at training load and restoration time. So what we see here is with particularly extreme and large workouts, you need at least 72 hours for extreme workouts, large workouts. Now again, there's not a whole lot of delineation here. Basically, if you have a high workload, you need somewhere between 48 and 72 hours of rest for a particular muscle group. If you have substantial loads, 24 to 48 hours, medium, small. When we look at individual muscle groups, and again, those are all hours. So small workouts, you know, light loads, you can do them every 12 hours, even for the same muscle groups. Now, when you talk small muscle groups, they need less than 12 hours to recover. Intermediate sized muscles need at least 24 hours. Large muscles need 48 hours or more. So like when you're talking the, you know, the muscles in the larger muscles in the thigh, the larger muscles in the back, they're going to need at least 48 hours to recover. So both of these recovery things that I'm giving you, the things that are on the PowerPoint here, this is actually a little bit more to do with the nervous system as far as the ability to recover. When you're talking about the actual muscle recovery, then you look at the size of the muscle. But again, all things considered, you have to look at how you're loading it, okay? In other words, if you do a max effort lower body workout, so say you go and you squat, you work up to a 1 to 3 rep max in the squat, and then work your other leg muscles, you're going to need 72 hours probably to be able to do another high intensity lower body routine in order to recover appropriately from that. Now, when we look at exercise order, again, typically large multi-joint exercises are done first. The reason why we're saying typically is because there are some circumstances where you may do a smaller, more isolated muscle exercise first. So we'll talk about why you would do that. Power is typically going to get trained first. So anytime you're doing something with a high nervous system demand, that's going to be the first thing that you're going to do. So if you know you're going to do some Olympic lifts, for max effort, dynamic effort method, those lifts should be performed first, okay? Larger muscle groups are going to typically get work before smaller muscle groups. Now, as I said, there are techniques that justify a change in order, okay? It's actually become very popular. Matt Wenning, who's a former power lifter, he's popularized doing smaller exercises in a circuit as a warm-up, warming up the muscles that work for the primary lift before doing the main lift. So in other words, before doing, for example, before doing like a heavy squat workout where it's like a max effort squat, and you're doing a squat variation, what he does is he takes you through a circuit of some high rep leg curls, reverse hyperextensions, and maybe some ab exercises. And the point there isn't necessarily to exhaust you per se, but it's to potentiate those muscles. So you potentiate the individual muscles, before doing the bigger movement. What that does is allows them to be more active, and you find it actually works on your conditioning a little bit. But again, that's something you have to work up to, and you have to make sure that when you are programming that, you're programming that in a responsible way. In other words, you don't want to do those exercises to exhaustion. You don't want to mess up that primary exercise, but you just want to make sure that you're basically getting them to fire. And again, those are things we talk about this stuff again in other classes, and if you have questions about it, we could talk about it in this class a little bit too. But in the programming classes and stuff like that, we talk about some of those more advanced, unconventional methods that you typically don't think of. But again, for the purposes of what we're doing right now and in most programming, these are kind of the rules that you kind of start with. Now, again, for the exercises, I want you to review the pages 358 through 406. I want you to look at the exercises and the muscle groups worked. Okay, so review that as a part of this. Go through, look at the exercises, familiarize yourself with the anatomy, what muscles are worked for each of the exercises. We're going to talk about some of the ways to break them up, and I have some examples of exercises. I have some videos, but I think I'm going to hold off on them. They're in here, but I'm going to hold off on discussing them for in class so we could kind of go through them a little bit more. So again, push and pull. So again, this is one way you could break things down when you're talking your multi-joint exercises. So all your pushing exercises or pressing exercises are things involving primarily the pec muscles, the triceps, and the shoulders. Your pulling muscles, your pulling multi-joint exercises are going to work the muscles in the posterior, your latissimus dorsi, your trapezius muscles, your rhomboids, your biceps brachii at your elbow. Okay. Now at the hip and thigh, we have exercises that work both hip and knee extension. That would be like your squatting motions. We have hip extension, which is primarily your deadlift variations. And then you have your single joint exercises. And you'd have your single joint exercises for the upper body as well, which we'll talk briefly about in a little bit. So when you look at the hip and thigh, you're either doing an exercise that involves both hip and knee extension. That would be things like your squats, your lunges, your split squats, your step-ups. Your hip extension movements would be your deadlift variations. Now, in a conventional deadlift, you do some knee extension, but primarily you're working hip extension, and that's mostly a posterior chain movement. And then you have your single joint exercises, your leg curls, and your knee extensions. You have your total body, which your book classifies as power exercises. Again, they're only power exercises technically if they're done for power. Your total body movements are your Olympic lifts. Okay. So your clean exercise, your clean, your snatch, your push press, your push jerk, they're kind of those power exercises. And again, for your other, you have your single joint upper body exercises. Again, things that work, your elbow, your shoulder, so all your variations. So as you're going through the textbook and you're looking at those exercises, they can all get classified in these categories that I'm giving you. So it might not be a bad idea to kind of make note of that as you're going through them. Now, I have videos. I'm actually going to skip past these videos and I'm going to show them in class. So I actually have videos of the clean and the snatch, and I'm going to go through the different phases of them. I'm going to skip it for the purposes of the video here, because I'm going to talk about them in class. So now resistance training frequency, again, we talked about this a little bit. It's really going to be based on the season. In the off season, typically somewhere between 4 and 6 resistance training workouts. It can go down to 3. Again, if you're doing that's usually what you do if you're working total body. In the preseason, so the preseason is when there's going to be like formal practices and things like that prior to the season. It could get knocked down to 3 or 4. In season, you're going to have 1 to 3, and then postseason could be anywhere from 0 to 3. You might not have any resistance training in the immediate postseason. You may just be doing some active rest. It kind of just depends. I would say most of the time the athletes that I worked with in my previous job, they were the ones that really liked to lift weights. They really wanted to get back into it. So my goal was to give them programs that they could still kind of recover from pretty easily. So in other words, those athletes and the programs I did there, they didn't involve a lot of squatting and deadlifting and bench pressing and things like that. Really early in the postseason, they tended to do just some, single joint, really easy stuff, almost acting as restoration. But I wanted to give them something because, they really wanted to kind of get into it. But, some athletes, if they have a lot of injuries and stuff like that, they may not be really ready to do much of anything. They may just need a week or two of just not doing anything prior to starting their off-season training. And these are your learning outcomes. So again, make sure, again, I'm going to emphasize this, make sure that you're looking at those exercises in your book. Use that classification scheme that I gave you with this in order to, because you'll be responsible for knowing those.